And we're back. This is the Catholic Lady reading Great Line of God by Taylor Caldwell. And this is Chapter 7, Part 2. An unprepossessing youth, though luxurious and plump, Simon ben Shabua, as he closely observed his nephew from the shadow of his silken hood, he is also too silent and stern of face, and abrupt of manner. His mother, my sister, was all grace and prattle and sweetness and courtesy. Hillel ben Baruch is pleasing of countenance and affable of manner. How was it possible for these two to produce such a son? Their daughter is charming, but this Saul resembles the less agreeable Romans. His father has written us of his intellect and the power of his mind, yet he has the manners of a peasant. In comparison to my brother David's son Ezekiel, is a paragon of beauty and graciousness and deportment. Though I had heretofore felt him the least captivating of the sons of their father, but these Pharisees! Simon had been one of the brothers who had opposed the marriage of his sister to Hillel ben Baruch. He thought of his own sons with complacency, but his daughters, he reflected, were not so beautiful as Sephora bas Hillel. However, one was already espoused to a Greek merchant, very rich and possessed of breeding and wit. Simon had considered Saul, before encountering him, as a possible husband for his daughter, Jochebed, the youngest and prettiest, and only 13, and his favorite. Were it not for the wealth Saul would inherit, Simon would have laughed at himself. When Hillel had seen the eternal land, never withholding her gifts of water and fruit and grain and serenity, Saul had seen an afflicted country, forlorn and desolate, where Hillel had observed the brown farmers faithfully plowing and seeding despite the Roman occupation, being wiser than the men of the cities. Saul had seen slaves and had wept in his heart for them, calling silently to them as brothers from his overwhelmed emotions. Hillel had heard birds and the wind and the laughter of children and women, the songs of the busy farmers, but Saul had heard only plaints and weeping and prayers for deliverance. Hillel had patience, and Saul's spirit had never known that virtue. In short, where Hillel had saw a certain tranquility, a simple wisdom, and entrancing beauty, Saul saw only turbulence, bitterness, and a lightless land stretching forth skeleton hands to the tardy Messiah, pleading for rescue, invoking curses on the blasphemous Roman, and longing not only to be free, but to be purified. He saw the Roman soldiers near Caesarea as they had passed that white and licentious city, but he had seen the amphitheater on the outskirts of where Roman brutality and unspeakable cruelty had their being in this ravished land. Here, captured zealots and Essenes had hung on crosses for their intransigence and patriotism and devotion to the Lord their God. Hillel had averted his eyes from the amphitheater and had softly murmured prayers for the dead and the repose of their souls in the bosom of Abraham. Men, he had thought, were hard and unjust and malicious, for that was their animal nature. If they had no victims, they invariably invented them. The reflection saddened Hillel, though he had never enthusiastically hoped, nor truly believed in the alleged good that lay, like a pearl, in the slimy musculature of a bestial organism. Men were men, more alike than unlike, no matter their religion or race. May God, blessed be his name, have mercy on them. But Saul did not follow his father's thoughts, and the people of Israel were unique in virtue to all other peoples and nations. Hence their martyrdom, He forgot that they were a warrior people, and that the scriptures had lauded their less attractive disposals of captives, no matter how helpless. Or if he thought about it at all, it was with the attending thought that God had been with their ensigns and their armies and the might of their swords. He had spoken of this to Aristo, who, after commenting that Israelites were remarkably like other conquerors, had expressed pity for the calumny against God, that he had allegedly blessed one army as ferocious as the foe, and had shown no mercy for the helpless enemy. Once Hillel had told Saul, and only recently, that when the Red Sea had drowned Pharaoh's soldiers and horsemen, the angels had wished to voice their joy. But God had rebuked them, saying, "My children lie under the sea, and you would sing?" Hillel had admitted that the story was possibly only a parable, and had smiled at his son, a little strangely. But Saul had been vexed. God had only one people, only one nation of sons, and all others were heathens and Gentiles. When Hillel had reminded him that it was prophesied that the Messiah would be a light unto the Gentiles, also Saul had remained silent. Saul could not have enough of seeing the land of his fathers, but he did not see what Hillel saw. Therefore his agony of spirit, the blue passion of the sky was lost to him, the green and golden earth, the orchards, the groves, the streams, the trees, and the vivacity of the market crowds, and the ancient towns through which they rumbled. The one fascination lay for him in their names, the birthplaces of heroes and prophets and patriarchs. He longed to see David's tomb and the great tomb of Rachel and the other holy places. He yearned not only to be in Jerusalem, but in Bethlehem, where the Messiah would be born. His sister Sephora, who was fascinating her kinsman in David's car, looked with lively interest on Israel, and pondered on her shy bridegroom in the car ahead, and sometimes peered at him with mischief if his eye caught hers. She had decided that he appeared kind and timid, and would not be a difficult husband. Hence she would have small trouble with him. She was a girl of much cleverness, and enjoyed life, and had shrewdness and wit, and possessed a naturalness of being which demanded little of others, and was humorous withal, and content with her fate. If she was not a young female of intense emotions, she was also incapable of hatred and gloom. She had affection for her father, and had loved her mother, but above all she loved Saul, and considered him afflicted, a matter time and kindness would mend. In the meantime, her wedding was approaching, and it would be a joyous occasion. Saul, too, would be caught in the singing and web of festivities, and perhaps even he would learn to smile again, and to laugh as he once had laughed, boisterously and with all his heart. The Roman road, as the entourage clattered thunderously in the sunset, some hours later, climbed many steep hills, and then dashed down into valleys strewn with little brown houses, and gardens and narrow pastures, and brooks and rills. When Aulus pointed to the empurpling distance and said, "Jerusalem," Hillel, who had bravely remained with him in the leaping chariot, turned his eyes in the direction of the far city and murmured, If I forget thee, Jerusalem, may my hand lose its cunning, my eye its luster and its sight, and my heart die in the dust." Aulus, who guessed his emotion, pretended to be giving all his attention to his horses, and the Roman was a pious man, who believed deeply in his old gods, and he revered piety in others. Nevertheless, he could not help but remember that the Jews had 24 distinct sects, all of which were vociferously proffered and declared the one true faith, and all the rest heresy. Still, he thought kindly, we Romans have adopted the Egyptian gods, and temples in Rome to Isis and Osiris and Seraphis, among others, and given them honors and support them with taxes. We are tolerant of all, and therefore we do not understand the insistence of Jews, and it bewilders us. We prefer law and order and universal peace. He was grateful for his Hannah, modest and sweet for all her indomitable will, who, while living implicitly as an old Jewess, and tolerance for her husband's belief. A remarkable matron, thought Aulus, longing for her comforting arms. He even permitted her to bore him with her repeated and patient explanations that there were in truth two main Jewish religions, one of prayer and synagogue, and one of the temple and embracing sacrifice and ceremony and learning. One simple and without ostentation, and the other great ritual and incense and priesthood. To Aulus, men were men, and God was God, and this seemed sufficient. But the Jews were contentious, and there was always alertness among the Romans for any incipient rebellion or riot or violence. For this was an abrasive people who never really submitted, and for that he secretly admired them. There was always at least one uproar in the surrounding provinces, alas, with resultant and ruthless carnage, and executions on the cross, and flayings alive. There were among the highest there upon the highest hill stood Jerusalem, yellow-gray, winding and slitted walls, and battlemented guard towers, seemingly not built by man, but only an outcropping of regimented stones on high bulwarks, yellow gold with autumn against the walls. On the crumbling, earthy bulwarks stood lone groups of stiff, black-green pointed cypresses, and an occasional stand of tall and dusty palms. Torches were already aflare on the battlements and against the walls, and thus their grim and stony yellowness was imprinted upon the dark purple sky, and the scarlet shadows fluttered over the stone, and even fingered down on the bulwarks. In the spring and summer, thought Hillel, if it is not so desolate, so forbidding, for the bulwarks are struck with ardent green and wild flowers. But he felt a deeper melancholy. As the holy days were approaching, the goat's hair tents of some pilgrims were already being cast on the bulwarks of the city, and the little red fires could be seen burning here and there, and the movement of lanterns. The city was always crowded later at this time of the year, every inn filled to bursting, and as the people from the provinces had neither the money for inns nor could find room, they were forced to bring their tents, their goats, even their geese and fowl and asses, to an occasional milch cow. This made for liveliness and the noise a little later, as the people increased in numbers. But now their only occasional presence on the rising bulwarks enhanced the lonely and abandoned scene. Hillel thought of their long, hot, and dusty journeys here, with their domestic beasts and their wives and children, and tears came down his eyes. Devotion to God still burned in the provinces, if not in Jerusalem and Joppa and Caesarea. The entourage entered through the Joppa gate, but were not challenged by the Roman soldiers on guard, because all recognized Aulus Platonius, and all saluted, and the standard of Rome in the vanguard. "Greetings, lads," called Aulus as the gates were opened, and he pulled up his chariot in the shadow of the arch. He spoke as if he had been absent for months and not for days. The officer in charge, a young man with a sun-darkened and weary face, saluted him, and came to the chariot and said, "Greetings, noble Aulus Platonius." All came to the chariot and said, "Greetings, noble Aulus Platonius. All is peaceful." "That is remarkable," said Aulus, and the officer grinned and looked curiously at the entourage. "My kinsmen," said Aulus, "I have conducted them from Joppa. If the officer felt some surprise that a Roman had so many Jewish kinsmen, who were apparently so very rich also, he did not reveal it. He looked with respect at the elaborate and handsome cars and the fine horses. Then he lifted his arm in salute again, and the entourage swept into the city. The iron gates clanged after them. In the smaller towns and villages and little cities, there had been certain gaiety, raucousness, and ease, even under the ubiquitous eyes of the Romans. The people went about their business, farming, selling, manufacturing, and negotiating. Life went on, they appeared to say with a shrug of fatality. A man must live in spite of disaster, but Jerusalem, that great and resounding city, the center of Mid-East culture and trade and commerce and wealth, and filled with many races, and had a certain indescribable somberness about it, a certain darkness and heaviness of spirit. Yet here the Hellenistic arete glowed very conspicuously among the cosmopolitan Jewish Sadducees, and there were many flourishing and active Greek colonies of merchants and traders and academicians and indolent, wealthy residents. And there were many Roman soldiers with their wives and families living here, not to speak of Roman bankers and businessmen and bureaucrats and administrators, many of whom had married Jewish beauties with their handsome dowries. Here lived Syrians, Persians, Arabs, Phoenicians, and others in the Semitic races, including Egyptians who taught in the Academy of Medicine, who were valued as cooks in the noblest of houses. If ever there was a heterogeneous city, as heterogeneous as Rome herself, Jerusalem was that city. Therefore, the intangible darkness and heaviness which lay on the city seemed incomprehensible. Even spring exuberance and summer bloom could not lighten it, nor its multitudinous gardens, nor its fine public buildings, handsome villas, clean streets, banking and brokerage houses, and the markets and the rich mercantile establishments. 1,000 different dialects and tongues could not lift its air of brooding and weighty contemplation, nor its wealth. Some said that it was because Jerusalem was so old and was bending under the history of the ages, and the devout Jews in Jerusalem mourned that she was now but a province of the Romans and could not endure Roman occupation. Hillel loved Jerusalem, but he recalled now that even as a boy he had felt the grave and subdued atmosphere of the city, and the Romans then were not so conspicuous as now. The more rigid of the Pharisees declared that God, in his temple, had wrapped himself in his cloak and had covered his face, because of the Romans and the defections of his people. Apparently, said some of the more erudite Romans with wryness, he had no other affairs to supervise. God, said the Pharisees, had thrown his face into shadow and with withdrawal until the day when his Messiah would be born and the Jews delivered forever from slavery and oppression. In the meantime, before that day arrived, God was incommunicado except to his elect, namely the Pharisees. And we're going to pause there, and that's the end of chapter 7, part 2. And we'll begin with part 3 shortly.